And we are live. Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're joined by Jacob Horne. Thank you for being here, Jacob.
Hey, guys. Good morning. Big fan. I'm glad to be here.
Definitely. So I know you just said we'll skip the backgrounds, but I do want to have you give a little bit of background for folks that don't know you. Many know you on LinkedIn, especially in the compliance space. But for folks that don't,
it's hard to avoid. If you get on LinkedIn and you look for anything related to compliance, the algorithm's just going to go, you must be interested in what this guy has to say. So I've been in cybersecurity now for 15 years. Originally started when I joined the Navy. This was sort of pre-U.S. Cybercom, so right before the existence of U.S. Cybercom, when it was even more of the Wild West, because there was no sort of top-down direction for how people got trained, or once you got training, what sort of mission you got put on. And through the magic of, military, billeting, I got stuck in a seat in the middle of the National Security Agency, which was a huge surprise and a really awesome mission. So over the course of those 15 years, I've basically, dabbled across a bunch of different disciplines in the what we would now call the broader cybersecurity field, which is everything from operations planning and computer network operations to, at the time, it was all computer network defense, blue team type stuff. That's what I did towards the tail end of my time on active duty. So when I got out, I did the sort of standard SOC analyst thing, living in Hawaii. So, shift work, hanging out in Hawaii. You can imagine how productive that was. And then when I decided to move back to Southern California, it just sort of turned out that not a lot of people with clearances were looking to move to LA. And most of the work that people were looking for, that type of profile, was in government acquisitions, sort of shepherding the NIST risk management framework ATO process for program offices out here doing aerospace and weapon system acquisitions. And that's when I really fell down the rabbit hole and have now popped out on the other side in the world of CMMC, which it's all connected under the hood, which we may get into later. But yeah, it's been a crazy arc here over the last 15 years of a lot of sampling, I think, if you will. Correct me if I'm wrong, Nikki. You're the one with the 15 PhDs. The sampling.
Oh, it's just two.
It's just two. It's only two. Which congratulations, by the way, right? You just got your second one, right?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's awesome. So big sampling period, and I really started to focus on the world of compliance, which who wouldn't want to settle on that after doing some more high speed stuff back in the day.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I wanted to hit on one point that you made, which was like, you've been in cyber for 15 years and it's sort of been this tried lots of different things. I feel like that really is cybersecurity, is we've all of like worked our way around.
Absolutely.
And tried lots of things.
Absolutely.
So with that varied background and logically out of all the other things that you could be doing.
I think the question is, why on earth would you have decided what's wrong with you, right? Did you lose a bet? Which would probably be, a good explanation, but it's interesting. So, I know you guys talk about the RMF process quite a bit and the ATO process and ways that can be improved in the federal space. And when I went to the program office at MilSatcom, which is now a Space Force, acquisition subcommand setup, it was all RMF work, right? Pretty standard. We've all sort of heard how this process works. It turns out that if you jump over and you go work for the large prime integrators like Northrop or Lockheed, they pay better, and you're effectively an RMF lawyer because the prime integrators know more about the RMF process than the program managers do on the government side. And so they pay for that kind of insight in order to mitigate their own risk, right? It's actually the way that RMF is supposed to work on paper is completely inverted in terms of the way that the knowledge in the ecosystem is actually distributed. So while I was working on a pretty awesome acquisition at Northrop Grumman, very high speed software development project for some cool space system stuff, we effectively tried to jam the RMF process into 12 months start to finish, which theoretically you can scale it up and down. It's like a catfish. It's going to fill up the size of the container you put it in. If it's a 10-year acquisition, suddenly RMF takes 10 years. If it's a 12-month acquisition, suddenly it's 12 months. And as you can imagine, when we tried to fit RMF into a 12-month, container, everything broke, right? It completely blew up in everybody's face. The interesting part, though, was we had a much closer relationship with the supply chain side of the house because of how quickly we were moving. And I got called into a meeting one day about in late 2017 or so, and they said, look at this document. What is this? And somebody slid 800-171 across the table. And I was like, this is weird. This is like a strange baby version of 850. What is this? Like, where's the rest of it? Right? Why is it all just bits and pieces of 853? And that was, my fatal flaw was I started asking questions, and they said, well, you're curious about it. Now you're the 800-171 guy. So as I started pulling the onion back, I had some colleagues that were working at the NIST MEP Center out here in Southern California. It's the largest one in the country. Big interface between NIST and small manufacturers because of the geographic area that we're in. They're all defense manufacturers. And so I had this weird opportunity pop up where somebody said, can you just come? You seem like you know what you're talking about. Can you just come explain what's going on? So, another sort of step removed from program office to prime integrator, now into the sub tiers of the supply chain. And very quickly after that, it was very apparent working with a new company every week that we have a serious problem on our hands. There is no security maturity in the DIB, basically whatsoever. And the regulations are changing and getting tighter and tighter at an alarming rate. So that just sort of sparked my curiosity in terms of how there's such a big delta between what is coming out of the regulatory space and what's happening on the ground versus what's happening in the primes versus what's happening on the government acquisition side. And so because of this peculiar sort of path that I took, I had a really unique perspective in trying to figure out, attempting to figure out a way to try to navigate what's going on here, depending on which audience you're talking to. So I didn't really enter into it being like, it would be fun. Compliance sure would be fun. But over time, it has turned into a very interesting problem, I think, because it's so difficult, right? It's so under-addressed. People are very disinterested in it. And that just is interesting to me. It's something that people are like, I don't want to figure that out. And it made me go, well, why not? Like, what's so bad about it? Like, is it really the case that it's unsolvable and that it can't be fixed? I mean, that feels to me, on like a personal note, it feels strange to me that the security community is sort of populated, if you will, by a large cross-section of people who pride themselves on solving hard problems, right? If you tell them that there's a problem that can't be solved, they're like, watch this, right? When it comes to compliance and anything, this is maybe up your alley, Nikki, anything that sort of starts to interface with humans or non-security humans, immediately we're like, whoa. I don't want to do that. That's compliance. I don't want to do that. And that's just a very interesting dynamic to me. It doesn't feel like it is a solved problem. Not claiming that I know how to solve it. It's just very interesting to me. So.
Yeah, I wanted to, before Chris hops in with his question, I just wanted to say it was very much the way I feel about vulnerability management. It's the same thing, right? Where it's like, it's complicated, it's hard, like we're just going to patch stuff and just move on, right? Like we did it.
Right.
But I think it's a definitely a worthy cause. So
yeah, it's a puzzle, just like any other set of problems that we have in the community, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing you said that resonated with me, and being prior military myself, is like how you became the SME for asking a question. In my case, I've been there because, like, if you know what an acronym means, like you're the person now.
Well, you know what Navy stands. So I was in the Navy. You know what Navy stands for, right? And never again volunteer yourself. So what I should have done was they started sliding a new NIST publication across the table. I'd be like, whoa, look at the time.
Yep, gotta go. Yep.
Yeah, so that's basically how it happened.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's good that you ask questions, because look at now, those asking of questions have led you to interesting conversations, and a lot of people look to you for answers now, which is really cool.
Well, that's sometimes, and this is something that I think we've all sort of started to discover in the CMMC space, NIST 800-171 space specifically, is there's a real drive, I think, towards being demanding solutions, right? Rather than being okay with the fact that some questions that we might ask may not have an answer yet. Like there may not be a good solution to them. And we'll probably get into this as we get into some of your other questions about just how this whole CMMC situation is going to shake out. There are some questions for which there are pretty good answers, and there are some questions for which we don't know what the answer is yet, and that's okay, right? That's perfectly fine. But yeah, it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, it's a good point on the not having the answers thing. I've noticed in security, like people are reluctant to like admit they don't know something. You know, there's like the whole psychological safety aspect and things that for sure is at play.
Oh yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask you too, you know, I have to ask this contentious topic is, you know, you're in compliance, you're living and breathing this stuff all day. We hear all the time, security, you know, compliance doesn't equal security. How do you feel about that question? Do you think it's accurate? And why do you think that phrase has really taken hold?
All right. Okay. So this is a whole dissertation. Nikki, you're now my advisor. So the idea of compliance versus security is endlessly humorous and frustrating to me, right? So when people say compliance doesn't equal security, the first thing that I think is duh. Like, of course it doesn't equal security. Now, what typically happens is when they say compliance doesn't equal security, they are commenting on, in my opinion, like one of two situations. And so it isn't really enough to just say the claim compliance isn't security. That's pretty obvious for most people. Typically what I've seen is that it stems from an area of frustration that people have where they don't like it that the business, or the business as we would call it in security, or some organization is equating their compliance with the idea of security. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Nikki, I don't know if this was an area of your research, but this is a very common issue in human psychology when we deal with specific metrics and goals. It is a phenomenon called surrogation. And this has been well documented in the field of psychology across all kinds of fields. If you give somebody a metric or a goal, they will eventually start to treat that metric or goal based on how high the stakes are as the goal itself, rather than the metric being the measurement of the goal. So you would see this a lot of times in organizations that are getting surveys. I saw this a lot in the NIST MEP program where it was satisfaction surveys. Pretty soon the score itself became the goal rather than using the score as a measurement or an indicator of the actual quality of the services being provided. Very, very common issue. It seems to be a fundamental flaw with how our human brains work. And so what ends up happening is if you put a very high stakes situation in front of a business and you say, this is the goal that you have to meet to be okay, the natural evolution that will happen in their thinking is, if I do this, I'm okay. And so people get frustrated with a psychological issue. Now, it's a much longer conversation for how you start to unwind that problem, right? I'm not exactly sure. That's just a much more complicated problem. So it's perfectly understandable to be frustrated with the fact that happens. Why it happens and how you deal with it is a little bit different. The problem, though, is that I think the term compliance does not equal security is uttered in frustration, and that ultimately is harmful to reducing our frustration because of the second reason, is that security is an unknowable state, right? You don't know when you are secure. You can only layer different amounts of assurance in front of somebody to try to indicate to them or give them a good feeling that, yeah, we're probably secure. We have a higher likelihood of being secure, right? And assurance is a function of verification. The less verification you have, the less assurance you have. And so you have to go through some amount of verification to have an increased amount of assurance to start to approach a more solid idea of security. So when you start to look at it that way, this dichotomy between security and compliance starts to feel kind of artificial to me. And if you go way back to, this is going to sound crazy, but if you go way back to some earlier versions of NIST special publications, like from the early 2000s, they actually kind of outline this philosophy that they have where they say, listen, these controls they sort of have two sides to them. That it's sort of a sliding scale between assurance and functionality. And I think that for the most part, the broader security industry has kind of we've even gotten rid of the term information assurance, right? And we have just sort of bled over completely into the realm of functionality. And now all of a sudden we're all looking at each other being like, we just talked about this yesterday, Chris, when the new supply chain risk management NIST publication came out. It's 300 pages of trying to achieve some level of assurance with other companies that you're dealing with in digital or physical, whatever the interface happens to be. And everyone's like, we need assurance. We need assurance. And everybody in the industry is like, well, we got all this functionality. What's the problem? So I think we need to come back into a better balance between those two ideas. So, I mean, security doesn't equal functionality. I mean, okay. I don't know if that doesn't really end that's the beginning of the conversation. That doesn't really do anything. And just to wrap up on that topic, when that frustration is manifested by security folks, when they say security doesn't, compliance is not security, right? I think that what ends up happening is the other thing that could happen is you are frustrated with bad requirements, right? Like if you have requirements that are objectively bad towards progressing, like they're not updated in time, or they don't cover the right technologies or anything, which is a known issue, right? And it's not universal, but it is a known issue, especially with specific controls. Then you don't have a problem with the act of compliance in and of itself. You have a problem with bad requirements. And that is a requirements engineering problem, much like surrogation is a human psychology problem. So, I know we've covered a whole lot here. It could be a whole separate podcast, but I don't think that it is a simple conversation. And I think that when we say compliance is not equal security, it doesn't help bring people together to try to improve verification. It just makes them throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we continue to have poor assurances.
Yeah, I like the answer. I like the assurance comment, and also it kind of alludes to the concept of, like you said, security is not an end state; it's more of a risk management state, right? To a level of risk that you're acceptable of. And then I wanted to ask you too, like, sometimes I feel like that comment's made by security practitioners who don't want to deal with the complexities and difficulties of dealing with compliance. Like, oh, that's not security. Like it's kind of a comment like that.
I just think that it is. I think that it is an artificial boundary that we have put up within the community. I know that compliance is yucky and that it's the part nobody likes. Compliance is, I always say, it's the Hufflepuff of all the cybersecurity disciplines. Like nobody wants to, I mean, they're fine, but nobody wants to be in Hufflepuff. People
you just made a bunch of Hufflepuffs.
Oh yeah,
mad.
They're going to be super.
Well,
here I'm going to make a bunch of other people mad too. I think that in the security community, we got a whole lot of people with cybersecurity engineer as their title, and we don't have a whole lot of cybersecurity engineering rigor. Because if you were to walk into a formal engineering, I'm not a formally trained engineer. I ended up working at an engineering firm at Northrop Grumman. And if you walk into a formal engineering firm and you tell the verification and test people that they're not doing real engineering and that verification doesn't equal engineering, you're going to get laughed out of the room, because the entire process of engineering something is requirements and the verification of those requirements. A very small subset is what we would consider the functionality part. The Mythbusters blowing stuff up and welding things together, that's a very small part of the engineering cycle, much like the overall sort of security cycle here of managing risk. We have, I think, completely abandoned really trying to formalize the discipline and improving the community of practice of security requirements verification.
I think I want to hit on 2 points here, because I think you hit on two things that we talk about sometimes. We've talked about with other people too. One of them is the terminology that we use, right?
Yeah.
How are we speaking about what we're actually doing, and who are we talking to about it? So this idea of compliance and like this negative stigma that comes with it, or this like negativity, oh, it's complex, it's difficult, it's hard. Instead of thinking about it as an aid or a complement to what we do in security, and that we can actually help each other if we talk to each other.
Oh man.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of communication, and especially when it comes to the terminology we use, but between teams.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a really great point. And this sort of leads into something that I'm always banging the drum about in the 171 CMMC space, is that the peculiar part about NIST standards is that you have something like 853, a control catalog, or 800-171, a weird baby version of a control catalog. You have 53A and 171A, which are the complements to them in the assessment procedures. And people usually look at it and they go, oh my God, this is terrible. I don't want to read this. But if you read the purpose of these assessment procedures, you'll notice that the purpose of the document is ironically exactly the same thing that a business owner might want that a engineer might want, that an assessor might want to provide assurances. They primarily exist to do three things. Is the control implemented correctly? Is it operating the way you intended it to operate when you made a management decision by policy? And is it producing the outcome that you need it to in order to be able to use it? Like, is it actually doing anything? And if you abandon that verification process and only go through the functionality and implementation process, you don't know those things, or you don't begin to approach knowing those things. So I think that the language part is an absolutely, valid point, because when you read these NIST pubs, Chris, you and I saw this yesterday, you throw up 300 pages of NIST pubs and you go, hey, this is really interesting. And people go, well, no, thanks. Like,
even the LinkedIn platform threw it back at me. It wouldn't even let me upload it all.
Well, yeah, you yelled at me for cutting out your software appendix, right? I had to like cut the back end of it off to even be able to upload it. So I think, from your perspective, Nikki, we have a design problem, right? We have a language problem. We have a design problem. It's not approachable. Compliance people are super weird. It's just, I'm obviously, right. And so it's not an easy situation, which sort of gets back to what I was saying about why it's so interesting, because, to me, the world of GRC is the interface between security and the business, because that's the interface by which you are taking stakeholder requirements and then verifying them. On the other side of the fence in security, that's all the implementation, functionality, sustainment, if you will, right? Lots of cool and very important things that are happening. But that translation interface between the two of them is a function of language, psychology, human factors, all your regulation, all sorts of, weird disciplines that you wouldn't normally think of if you were just in the security side of the house, right?
Yeah, I think the second point I wanted to make, which very much aligns with what you're saying about human factors and psychology, but again with engineering, right? This sort of this idea that in research and academia, we use the scientific method very heavily, right?
Yeah.
That's what we base all of our foundational research and how we what methods we choose, things like that. And it's the same way with engineering principles.
Yeah.
That I agree we haven't really brought into security, but I think that part of the challenge is security engineering means so many different things.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's been kind of a catch-all phrase for a lot of really specific skills and skill sets. But it's sort of been like security engineering. That fits everything.
It's I mean, security is always, it's the upside down from Stranger Things, right? Like, we have this sort of mirror image of whatever section of the organization we are interfacing with, and we sort of borrow their language and we sort of borrow how they operate, and it mirrors what's going on, but it's not exactly the same thing. And so it's, I think this is way beyond the scope of what we were going to talk about, but the skills gap that we keep talking about isn't just the engineering technical side. I think it's a function of the fact that we're looking at the mirror side of most elements of most organizations, right? There's this new interface into security considerations. And so you end up having to plug somebody that walks and talks like the folks in those various sections of the organization. And I mean, that's a huge challenge. It's a huge issue. And, I mean, that's why I find it so interesting.
Yeah, I had a question for you too on the topic of like compliance frameworks. We seem to be very reactionary. If you look at like CMMC, a reaction to like, the pilfering of the DIB, for example, or the lack of maturity. And then look at like, things like FedRAMP and cloud adoption. Like, we're always very reactionary with these things. And as we do that, we start to add on more and more. And it gets very complex to navigate it all, especially for people like you and I who aren't strange and like to read these documents.
Oh man, I can only imagine. Yeah.
So like, do you think we have a problem of framework sprawl, and why are we always reactionary? How do we address that kind of approach that we take?
Well, there's two things I think here is that at a first glance, there is a framework sprawl problem. What I always tell people is that you can only it's all, 6 degrees of separation from 853, right? The metaphor that I use is that if you study 853, it's like studying Latin, in that it's pretty nebulous and inert on its own, but it really helps you understand what's going on if you move into a more specific framework, if you will, that comes out, somewhere else, right? I think Cisco just sort of released their own sort of fusion of cloud controls yesterday. for public release. And there's various sort of sub-disciplines that you can move into with their own frameworks. I think that because, like Nikki, like you were saying, different disciplines have just sort of emerged and run with what their needs were, and there hasn't been a lot of, if it's even possible, a lot of coordination around the community and sort of this discipline of what's going on. You end up just with like forks of the same fundamentals over and over again. You know, there's a lot of people that sort of move away from NIST controls because they're too detailed, and you get into other frameworks. And my question is always, well, how do you know that the control is implemented? What assessment procedures did you use? Or are you just using this as a tool to conceptualize functionality, which you know, compounds this same problem and probably leads to more frameworks, right? I think that we sort of have to come back to first principles. Not saying that 853 and NIST controls are beyond reproach here. They do have some fundamental design issues to them, but I don't think that recreating the wheel seems to be improving things. It just causes, you know, Chris and I can barely keep up posting about how many frameworks there are.
Yeah, I was going to ask you too, one more question, like on the topic of frameworks. You know, there's obviously the complexity aspect in navigating it all, but we've heard a lot about the affordability aspect when it comes to 800, 171 and CMMC and the DIB. You know, I want to ask, like, on one hand, you know, you know, you need to pay the price to do business in this line of work, especially with sensitive information and national security. But we also have seen like a 40 to 60% consolidation of the DIB in the last 10 years. So how do we balance, you know, bringing a robust ecosystem of opportunities and innovators to the DIB, but also having a secure DIB as well?
Man, I mean, you guys got another 2 hours. So, you know, here's the first thing, right? On an economic perspective, cybersecurity is a classic market failure, right? If every company acts in their own self-interest and does what they believe is probably optimal for security, collectively, the external effect is that it doesn't actually achieve what we all sort of collectively want to have happen, right? It is a negative externality. And we've seen this in the DIB, right? If you were to just say, you know, government, get out of the way, no regulation, no enforcement, no verification whatsoever, let security emerge organically on its own, the defense industrial base would be the most secure industry sector on the planet, right? And that just isn't what happens, because companies the market does not adequately deal with this problem, and that's okay. The problem is that in economics, typically there's only like 3 ways to deal with market failures like that. You either subsidize the thing you want to have happen, you tax the thing that you don't like happening, or you regulate and force people to do what they will happen. I don't think we're going to be able to tax bad cybersecurity. We're really making people mad here at the end. I don't think that we're going to see a lot of subsidies, because that's what everybody's been asking for, and they don't seem to be coming. I mean, everybody keeps saying, whoa, the DoD should pay for it, or, oh, this agency should pay for it, or somebody should pay for it. And that's probably true, but it doesn't seem to be around the corner anywhere. So that means they're going to regulate. And the problem with regulations is there are trade-offs, right? It is a forcing function, but it is a barrier to entry. It makes costs go up. The smaller you are, the higher those barriers and costs are on a relative basis. And the sort of, you know, thing that I've been repeating for the last 2.5 years is not that I agree that those things are good. It's that the DoD has repeatedly acknowledged that in the trade-off decision that they are making between trying to inject better verification to seek assurance about the governance of their data in the supply chain, they're going to crack some eggs. And when you don't see anybody coming around with subsidies, when you don't see the major industry groups or the primes or anybody putting a stop to it, it implies, how long are you going to wait until you sort of see the writing on the wall? And, you know, this is a much longer conversation around how this whole thing has evolved over time. But how do you fix it? Like, how do you lower barriers to entry when your only option to seek assurances is something that inherently raises barriers to entry? I don't know, man. I mean, that's it's a real problem. It's a serious problem. And that's why, you know, it's not a FUD thing. This is not it's not a sales pitch. I'm just letting people know, if you take a step back and you look at what's happening in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of regulation, frameworks, and people seeking assurances that are external stakeholders to your business, it is very apparent that this is not a wave that's receding. It is getting bigger.
It sounds like we need a part 2. I think we're going to need a part 2 episode with you because I feel like we really just sort of scratched the surface of so many different topics. So that's going to take us to our last question for you. What does cyber resiliency mean to you?
Oh, man. You're going to make me ponder this like as much as the security versus compliance question.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, in terms of resiliency, I mean, can I give an answer that resiliency is like a negative state of, being not fragile organization? I guess maybe as I explore a subpar answer here live, this is something that the first thing that I thought of was sometimes when I would work with small organizations and they would look at something like 800-171, they go, where do I start? Right? Where do I start? And I would always tell them that, listen, if you just do the sort of NIST CSF category of what's going on, it's going to be a while before you started to change the tone around here and sort of change what's going on. You might want to start at the end and say, what are we going to do when an incident happens? Because we basically have no plan. I guess, what does cyber resiliency mean to me is maybe changing the focus on that NIST CSF wheel to bias it towards what happens after an incident rather than beforehand, which I think is sort of maybe a classic answer. People might say it's a bit of a cop-out answer. If we do a part 2, I will have a better answer for you.
I thought it was a very above par answer.
Oh, okay.
That's just me. Well, I want to, before I take us out, is there anything that people should be looking for from you or checking you out on LinkedIn or anything that you want to talk about today?
I will warn you, right? I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn, but the algo giveth and the algo taketh away. And if you start searching things for CMMC, I will be in your algorithm probably forever. So just make sure that's what you're interested in finding. I think, Chris and I post on similar things that sort of run the gamut, but I take a heavy focus on the defense industry, 800-171, NIST standards, and the status of the CMMC program and regulation. So it's the best place to find me. We put out a lot of content through Summit 7 on our YouTube page, as well as on our blog, which are easy to find, cmmc.video and cmmc.blog, which is a great place to find some of the content that doesn't always make it to LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jacob, for being here today and for answering all of our questions around compliance, CMMC, skills gap.
How hard could it be in 30 minutes? This was great.
No, it was perfect. Thank you so much. And we'll see everybody next week.
See you guys. Thanks.
See ya.